To the subscriber Seth, this is the first article that came to mind with respect to Schauberger and Snow, the learned scientist and the star in the Hailstone. That's on page 193 of The Water Wizard. So I'll go ahead and read that. I'll just place my phone in front of this paperweight here. Seems appropriate for the topic. The learned scientist and the star in the Hailstone, a rare but true incident. An article in Die Wiener Tag, number 3381, Sunday, 16th of October, 1932, page 2 by Victor Schauberger. Okay, there's some German in this, and I'm not fluent, don't speak German, so you're gonna have to forgive my German. I'm gonna butcher it probably. In 1932-33, Victor Schauberger wrote a spate of about 11 articles concerning a number of subjects related to his theories on water, which appeared mainly in the Viennese newspapers and professional publications, such as Die Wiener Tag, Wiener Neuester Nachrichten, Neue Freien Presse, Architektur und Bautechnik, etc. Some of the articles may well have been reformulations of the treatise he originally wrote for Die Wasserwitchkraft, from which publication had been refused after Professor Philipp Falkheimer's death. The purpose of these entertaining stories, one of Victor's rare excursions into fiction, was twofold. On the one hand, seeking ever available possibility to disseminate his theories, he used it to explain the formation of hail, and on the other hand, to get his own back, in part by poking fun at the thoroughly antagonistic attitude of Dr. Ehrenberger, who relentlessly sought to thwart Victor Schauberger's every action and to bring his name into disrepute. Ehrenberger was also the individual principally responsible for seeing to it that no further treatises on Victor Schauberger's were published in Die Wasserwitchkraft after Professor Falkheimer's death. This is the beginning of the article. A fairly long time ago, an absolutely absurd assertion appeared in a Viennese newspaper, namely, 1. That the generally widely held view that the sun is a molten, incandescent fireball with extremely high temperatures, and 2. That the definition of water by the equally well-known formula H2O are the two greatest scientific misconceptions, the consequence of which will result in not only the economic collapse of all civilized nations, but also the growing unemployment that now affects ever wider circles. A few days after the article addressing the theme was published, a champion of science appeared in the editorial office of the newspaper. In extremely unflattering phrases, he informed the editor of the enormity of such irresponsible statements, which were highly conducive to creating confusion in the minds of immature young men. The scientific advocate demanded an immediate retraction, stating that the newspaper had either been sold a pump or had been the butt of a bad joke. The editor refused to accede to this demand, fearing that it would endanger the reputation of his newspaper. Because of this, the editor made an effort to persuade the learned scientist to adopt a slightly more objective view of the article in question. He pointed out that in the main, as history relates, the most important innovations and inventions had been made by outsiders. He also stressed that even if the two assertions by the author were only partially correct, then a change such as the world had never experienced before would have to occur in the whole economic situation. The editor vividly describes the consequences that would inevitably ensue once these scientific misconceptions were clarified and recognized for what they were. He further outlined what an end to the appalling unemployment would imply. Millions of people would be saved from starvation, and our children, who can only see a dark and dismal future, would now look forward to an improvement in this dreadful, daily worsening situation. The editor further tried to show that if these two fundamental tenets of science were actually misconceptions, then not only would the entire educational system have to be changed, but many laws and public institutions too. In such an event, all our work in such areas as agriculture, forestry, water, and electricity resource management, together with the whole range of findings in physics, chemistry, botany, geology, etc., would be seen to be found on false premises, that they were wrong. He then drew attention to the increasingly apparent mistrust of our children and their disenchantment with our present methods of working, which had already brought us to unemployment and them to absolute hopelessness. He concluded with the comment that even he himself, before he was even aware of the article, had become convinced that this frightening economic collapse was no accident, but could only be the result of serious errors somehow committed by our leading economists. Taking considerable pains, however, the learned scientist eventually succeeded in causing the journalist, who was not well versed in these matters, to change his mind. It was finally agreed that in the near future the newspaper would publish an appropriate refutation to these outrageous assertions, to be signed by several scientists. In addition, the editor was requested to reject any such articles in the future. Satisfied with the result, the elderly man now betook himself homewards, after formulating in his mind the rebuff he was going to prepare for the author of those articles, which were as absurd as they were laughable. In his excitement, the learned scholar failed to notice the approach of a large thunderstorm, from which a few hailstones had already fallen to the pavement. Suddenly he was struck in the head by a hailstone the size of a pigeon's egg, and with a painful lump on his head, the old man quickly sought shelter in a nearby doorway. After a short time, the thunderstorm passed. With an increasingly severe headache, the scholar continued on his way homeward bound, and upon entering his house, lay down to rest. From his resting place, he espied 2 hailstones which had entered the bedroom through the open window, and which, warmed by the rays of the sunlight falling on the floor, now slowly began to melt, creating a small rivulet of water. As he looked at these 2 hailstones, larger than hazelnuts, apart from becoming aware for the first time of the danger he had now narrowly escaped, his scientific interest was now aroused, and he perceived a brilliant, shining crystalline nucleus in the center of the hailstones, whose origin, as is well known, has already occupied a large number of clever minds without success. Reflecting on this difficult problem, he became aware that his agonizing headache had become far worse. He suddenly hit upon the obvious idea of using such a hailstone as a poultice to assuage the increasingly acute pain caused by the swelling. The hailstone had hardly been applied to the wounded spot before the pain began to ease, and under its soothing coolness, while still watching the remaining hailstone melt on the floor, the man of learning turned his thoughts once more to the problem of the mysterious star in the hailstone. The star in the hailstone began to shine more and more brilliantly, until a bright, cold, brain-penetrating pair of eyes bored into those of the recumbent scholar. Without taking its eyes off him, the icy gray form slowly stood up from the floor, to the amazement of the old man. What at first had appeared to be a puddle on the floor was actually the cloak in which the increasingly distinct figure was enveloped, and which now began to speak as it slowly approached the eminent savant. For decades at school you have taught that the sun is a molten fiery ball of over 6,000 degrees Celsius. For decades you have described water, the blood of the earth, with the ridiculous formula H2O. All the while that you have disseminated these misconceptions in several influential journals, many of your students have themselves become teachers. Some have spread your doctrines even further afield, while others have put them into practical use in accordance with the laws of the land. More and more of your theories are taking root in the minds of millions of people, thereby greatly increasing your authority and standing, because these theories have become the basis of all scientific professions and governmental instrumentalities. All your fellow human beings are now at their mercy. These theories have spawned a virus that has caused the dying of nature that is absolutely devastating and without parallel. Because of your theories, not only was the happiness of your fellow men slowly but surely destroyed, but with them, you have also disturbed the whole world, including me in my infinite remoteness and peace. You have forced me to come from the very ends of the earth to fall upon your addled plate. Shaking his head, the eminent scientist observed his adversary, who quietly continued to speak. Were water merely H2O, as you affirm, then there would be no plants on your earth, no animals, and hence no human beings. For in reality, water is neither H2O, which in all organisms is a poison, nor is it contaminated with impurities, as you have so appetizingly suggested. The substances you describe are impurities, as impurities are actually the substances, carbones, added to water in conformity with natural law, which, raised from the earth by the sun, create all life and therefore even you. What right have you to call these vital, life-giving substances impurities when you yourself would categorically deny being the product of impurities? In the following, I will tell you the truth for the sake of the multitudes of poor people, and especially for the many innocent children who are now forced to accept your false theories and their consequences at school, as a result of which they must perish pitifully, because through their work, based as it is on false premises, they will inevitably destroy the very preconditions for their own existence. I will also tell you the truth so that you will be able to solve the problem yourself, a problem whose solution countless people are seeking even today. They will never find it, because they have all been led astray by your misguided theories. In consequence, you are now in charge with the inalienable duty, regardless of any repercussions accruing to you personally, to make it known that everything you have so far taught is fallacious and does not conform to the actual facts. In nature, all life is built of carbones, which consists of plant residues and which, through the action of the oxygen infiltrating into the depths along with the water, are raised from the earth under the influence of the sun's heat in order to promote the formative processes mentioned above. This process is to be attributed to the breathing in the so-called living space, which, with the help of the sun and the aid of water, takes place in the following simple fashion, which now perhaps may even become clear to you. In nature, all life is built of carbones, which consists of plant residues and which, through the action of oxygen infiltrating into the depths along with the water, are raised from the earth under the influence of the sun's heat in order to promote the formative processes mentioned above. This process is to be attributed to the breathing and the so-called living space, which with the help of the sun and the aid of water takes place in the following simple fashion, which now perhaps may even become clear to you. As is well known, water is also the carrier of heat. When the sun rises in the morning, warmth spreads through the living space, causing the boundary between the atmosphere and the stratosphere to become displaced upwards. The shift in the boundary layer occurs within certain limits, however, which enclose the Earth's surface from above and below in the form of two neutral strata. The position of the neutral stratum itself varies quite considerably within the boundary zone and is altered slightly due to fluctuations in temperature between night and day, and is displaced to a greater extent by sudden changes in weather at different times of year. With the movement, advance, and retreat of both neutral strata, the oxygen from above and the suitably conditioned carbones from below will be brought into the living space. In precisely this way, as simple as it is sublime, the heartbeat of the earth is factually activated. This breathing process is absolutely essential because of it, the formative substances are made to commingle with the water in the atmosphere. Under the influence of the alternation of light of night and day, the substances then build up the various forms of vegetation, to which the very widest sense the sun also belongs. In passing through the lower neutral stratum, which is characterized by the temperature of plus 4 degrees Celsius. This concept, of course, is only to be considered on a strictly relative basis. The strongly carbonated water rising from the depths charges its capacity to dissolve the precipitated matter. Having transversed the stratum and arriving at the vegetation zone of the Earth, the water, now under the influence of atmospheric oxygen, must deposit the carbones carried up from below in the form of sediment. In this process, the water eventually becomes deficient in carbones and replaces them with oxygen, thereby becoming heavier, and together with the oxygen sinks back into the depths of the Earth after the sun sets. Now deep in the carbon sphere and exposed to extremely high temperatures, the oxygen becomes very aggressive and actuates the necessary oxidizing processes. Under the influence of the sun, the products of these processes will be carried up to the surface of the Earth by the water, constantly ennobling themselves en route. Similar processes take place in the zone above the upper neutral stratum, but in accordance with the conformities of natural law, they occur in an inverted form. Sorry, this is sometimes a tongue twister to read this. For certain reasons, too lengthy to explain here, the carbones carried up to the greater heights by the water vapor must constantly be further ennobled, etherealized, until such time as their conformity with natural law reverses as they pass through the upper neutral stratum. Here, the hydrogen is left behind and the carbones eventually become carrierless. Having now become carrierless, the highly etherealized carbones stream upwards towards the sun, where, due to the effect of the extremely low temperatures, the most refined and ennobled oxygens are concentrated. Here, the high-grade carbones will be transmuted into their most highly transformed state, into pure energy. The rays emitted from these epicentral focus of oxidation undergoes a warm oxidation in their return journey, thus participating in the opposite process that occurs on their way towards the sun. I'm going to read that part again. Here, the high-grade carbones will be transmuted into their most highly transformed state, into pure energy. The rays emitted from these epicentral focus of oxygen undergoes a warm oxidation on their return journey, thus participating in the opposite process that occurs on their way towards the sun. The region from the sun to the neutral stratum, which is now under the influence of a negative temperature gradient, encompasses that part of the radiation spectrum in which the rays from the sun are not immediately perceptible, as well as the bandwidth where these have in part already been transformed into light rays. The region from the upper neutral stratum down to the Earth's surface, which equally exhibits a negative temperature gradient, is to be described as the region where conversion into heat takes place. What happened to the hydrogen, which was gradually left behind en route towards the sun? Due to the extremely low temperatures at this high altitude, it crystallized into fine ice particles, having attained its highest state of aggregation after surpassing the upper neutral stratum. A process now takes place which is of extreme importance. Each one of these minute particles of ice carries with it a nucleus of very dense oxygen. Due to the absorption of this highly condensed and crystallized oxygen, the fine ice crystal increases in weight, overcoming the considerable buoyancy active at these altitudes, and the fine ice body begins to fall according to the laws of gravity. When these fine ice crystals reach the lower, warmer zones, it thaws. Upon passing through the upper neutral stratum on its way down, the carrier, hydrogen, alters its state of aggregation and dissolves, becoming free in the process. The oxygen now mixes with the air, simultaneously reducing its aggressiveness and thus forming a less complex form of oxygen. An analogous process, even if in inverted compliance with natural law, we also find in the Earth. Accompanying the atmospheric water, not only do the denser forms of oxygen succeed in infiltrating the Earth, but to a certain extent, the very valuable carbones do as well. Without the interaction between these substances, the solution of salts present in the root zone and lower down cannot take place correctly. With the aid of these aggressive carbones and oxygen, the salts in the ground will now be dissolved and transformed into various forms of nitrogen. These substances alone can be properly processed by the plants. Taking place with the aid of sunlight, this transformation enables the fluids in the water rising in the vascular bundles be transformed into sugars, starches, and cellulose. Some of the refined and ennobled carbones, however, depart in the direction of the sun, as described earlier. Without these natural processes, the buildup of any vegetation would be impossible. When these great conformities are disturbed, then a degeneration takes place, which is synonymous with the qualitative decline in all forms of vegetation. With a sudden drop in temperature, also the result of the disturbances, sometimes the previously described fine ice crystals do not have time to melt and can actually reach the earth. Due to the extreme cold they emanate, they gradually become sheathed with the solid layer of ice on their way down, which even the air's resistance cannot remove. In this manner, larger ice bodies are formed, each of which carries the mysterious star in the center. One of them wounded you today. As you may recall, Hobiger, that brilliant researcher, also spoke of the enormous degree of coldness possessed by these fine granules of ice, which come from the coldest and highest regions of the stratosphere. In any case, even with Hobiger, it ought to have been obvious to you that the well-known gas nebula can only be formed at low temperatures in accordance with the simplest laws of mechanics, and hence in these zones the high temperatures that you always talk about cannot exist. But all you scientists are a very peculiar breed. Every one of you consistently places himself beyond all connection with the world around him, and because of your one-sided specialization, you increasingly divorce yourself from all reality and the actual workings of nature. Inevitably, therefore, each of these areas of specialization has produced a certain phony finding, whose application and effect, however, have changed the face of the earth. In their totality, these effects have become so large that they even affect the natural development of children, forcing their thinking and reasoning, even their whole being, into unnatural ways. In this process, these young, developing human beings are ultimately robbed of the interconnection with nature they received at birth. Only thus could this dreadful curse of decay have engulfed humanity that has set the force of one-sided mechanistic technology against a second, stronger, and far more efficient natural force, the organic eco-technology in Mother Earth. The only possible outcome of your monstrous aberrations is the enormous misery of vast multitudes with which will greet you at every street corner in the most pitiable fashion from the eyes of children, mothers, and old men. This is where the being's explanations ended. The factual explanations of the learned scientist's adversary, especially the line of argument using the laws concerning the dynamics of gases, had irritated him enormously. Seeing himself slain by his own weapons, his opponent's final rebukes completely robbed him of his composure. Furious, he sprang up, only to sink back immediately with a cry of pain, and he woke up. At the point where just a quarter of an hour earlier he had placed the improvised ice pack, he now felt a burning pain and quickly summoned the doctor. The doctor soon diagnosed a severe cold in the head and applied his remedies accordingly. Despite the most careful attention, the condition of the patient deteriorated and a fever became more and more intense. The doctor was bewildered by this inexplicable phenomena. Upon the doctor's repeated questioning, the sick old man related his dream. Slowly it became clear to the doctor that his treatment had been inappropriate and that he was not here concerned with a chill, but rather with inflammation of the tissue. While the less complex atmospheric oxygen is able to bring about transformations of far-reaching importance when it comes into contact with the rising carbones in the earth, the oxygen contained in atmospheric water causes even more far-reaching transformations. What dangers, therefore, must the high-grade, aggressive oxygen contained in fine ice crystals, which are approximates rays of energy, trigger off in the overheated blood of the earth dweller with the headache? Impressed by this new understanding, the doctor at once became aware of the enormous danger that has now threatened the life of his learned patient. The direct consequence of the release of oxygen from the ice crystal into the feverish head of the eminent scientist lay the danger of the development of cancerous decay, and a phenomena we are unfortunately already able to observe throughout our forests. The spread of cancerous disease in the trees is the result of a carbon-deficient and oxygen-enriched water rising in the trees' capillaries due to the exposure of the most shade-demanding species of timbers to the light. Having become aggressive due to the warming effects of the direct solar radiation, the oxygen now promotes the development of swelling through the decomposition of tissues. This ultimately causes the cancerous tumors that have now spread through almost our entire high forest. Because of the doctor's new perceptions, his method of treatment changed and the eminent scholar recovered. Rumor has it that for months and months he has been working on the rebuttal, which at the time he had so unwisely promised the editor. Victor Schauberger, Vienna, 1932.